Hey guys, it's Sean. It's kind of weird and awkward. I've never done this before, but since the holiday break is so long, I will be making a couple videos that you'll need to watch and be prepared when you come back. So the first video we're going to talk about is the history of Chicago. I thought since you were going on the trip and I haven't taught the history of Chicago for a while, it would be a nice way when you see the city, you know a little bit about it and its history. The first Western Europeans, at least, to arrive in Chicago were the French. You know how the Spanish mostly took over South America and Latin America. The British went along the East Coast much later, 1620, after Jamestown, 1608, 1609, something like that. The French had come in through the waterways to the north, like the Hudson Bay, through the St. Lawrence River, and sort of traveled the waterways down through the Mississippi, the Great Lakes. So the French were the first Europeans to get there. The Potawatomi Indians actually were already native there. And the modern city, though, as you would think of Chicago, was incorporated in 1837. And it grew incredibly fast because of its geographic location. It was on the Great Lakes. The Chicago River was there. It had access to the Mississippi River. It had access to the entire East, eventually through the railroads that are built. The cattle being raised in the Midwest were driven to Chicago to the meatpacking plants. All of this happened very, very, very quickly. And a lot of the city was built on the back of immigrant labor. The fire of 1871 is probably the most traumatic event in the history of Chicago. There's a story, and keep in mind immigrant labor, there's a story that the fire started in a barn. Mrs. O'Leary, I don't know why they blame her, poor Mrs. O'Leary, forever blamed for this, but her cow apparently kicked over a lantern. They couldn't put the fire out in time. Now you think in modern city, how could it burn? Back then, Chicago and most cities of the time were predominantly wooden structures. There was no zoning. Houses were built nearly, if not touching each other. You had shacks built out of old wood. It's summer, I believe. It's dry. Something touches off in the hay, and suddenly you've got entire city blocks, like mile. They might have covered 1 or 2 miles of the city burned. Now, the reason I bring up immigration is now people don't think it was Mrs. O'Leary's cow. It was her barn. But there may have been some illicit gambling going on. You know, gambling wasn't legal, but hey, that's never stopped anybody. Some people were playing cards and something happened and a lantern got knocked over. Why admit that you did it when you can blame a cow? The cow, if it lived, couldn't tell anybody different anyways. But that gives us the idea, 2 things about immigration. 1, the city was founded on the labor of immigrants. The meatpacking plants were mostly immigrants. The steel mills, the factories, most of the unskilled labor was performed by immigrants. There was also an anti-immigrant sentiment at the time. This might sound familiar to now, you know, whites and people who'd been here for a while saying that the immigrants were driving down the price of labor, that they shouldn't be here. These things have always been in our history, unfortunately. So if you've got to blame somebody, Mrs. O'Leary, that's an Irish name, why not blame an immigrant's cow? So that's kind of the story of the fire. One of the interesting things, though, about the fire is once they got the fire out, which took a few days because there's no fire trucks, literally bucket brigades. You might have an old pump truck, but there's no fire hydrants. You don't really have running water really yet in 1871. It takes a long time. It was windy. Sparks were, you know, parts of the city would catch on fire, and then they'd nearly get that out, and a spark would float half a mile away and catch another building on fire, and it was just crazy. So anyway, the bucket brigade, it takes a while to get it out. So you've got this basically center part of the city, over a mile or so, devastated. What they ended up doing, and it was almost a blessing in disguise, like a lot of fires at different points in different cities. It's bad for the people there, but this implements for the first time city planning in Chicago and other cities when they burned. the lakefront property. When you get there, you will see along the lake, there's basically a strip that's quarter-mile wide, somewhat. It's very, very wide, and it's all park along the downtown loop. Loop is called, the downtown of Chicago is called the Loop. All along Lake Michigan, there's this gorgeous park that's green space for everyone. That was basically set aside. What they did was they took the debris from the fire, pushed it into the lake, put dirt on top of it, and kind of created new land out of the lake that nobody owned, and said, we're gonna set this aside for the people of the city. Because about 1870s, 1880s is when things change in America and the Western world, when you start to get something called leisure time, something we totally take for granted. Instead of working 16, 17 hours a day, 7 days a week, 6 days a week, people were down to 10 hours, 12 hours. They had a little bit of free time. So they had to have something to do and somewhere to go. That's when you start to get museums. Chicago, I'm not sure which museums you guys are gonna see. Hopefully you'll get to see Shedd Aquarium. I don't know if you'll get to see the art museum or not. The idea of these museums so that people can share in the culture of the city and the world and the art and the zoo, and all of this comes around at about that same idea. So without the Chicago fire, even though it was devastating, you wouldn't have the green space that you're going to see along the lake that hopefully you'll enjoy. If you see the giant Buckingham Fountain, probably known for at least people who lived in the 90s from the beginning of the TV show Married with Children. Yeah, and it started there. It's been around for a long time. It's this huge, gorgeous fountain. All of that wouldn't be there without the Chicago fire. Now, going back to the idea of immigration, they said immigrants were incredibly important, but not always well loved. To make a point of that, an author by the name of Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle, based in Chicago. He was trying to tell the story of a Polish immigrant who comes to Chicago, struggles, the things he faces, which were like an everyman immigrant struggle. He gets a job in a meatpacking industry, talks about the politics of Chicago and buying votes and people stealing money and him trying to survive. And it talks about him specifically working in the meatpacking plants. The book is not famous though for the struggles of this immigrant. It's famous for the horrible conditions, not necessarily working conditions, which were bad, but the conditions of the meat. The things that Upton Sinclair wrote about, he was a muckraker journalist, by the way, someone who was trying to make society better. He wrote about how rat droppings and rat and human, if you lost a finger, everything went into the sausage. And they would hold meat in the basement for months with dripping water going into it and rotting and all of that going into the sausage. And it created such a stir. Nobody cared about the immigrant in the story, unfortunately. But it created such a stir that's where we get the Food and Drug Administration from. Supposedly, Teddy Roosevelt was eating breakfast, eating sausage while he was reading The Jungle. Literally made him sick, and he said the government has to step in and do something about this. We cannot have people eating unsafe food. So after that, Chicago has been basically growing ever since. This is gonna be hard for you guys to understand. If you've probably never driven or ridden in a car in Chicago, you can literally be in downtown Chicago, head west and drive an hour, and you are still in the city. It's gonna be called something else, it's gonna be in a suburb, but it is pretty much urban from the lake all the way out, all the way up into Wisconsin, all the way down into Indiana. It's all urban, it's huge. Now, make sure you pay attention to your surroundings and everything. You're probably safer in downtown Chicago than you are nearly anywhere else in the world. The police there are fantastic. They do a great job. They're an international city. They want tourists from everywhere. I don't want anyone to think that you hear these shootings in Chicago. None of that happens in those areas. Those areas are fantastic. I used to live there myself. They're wonderful areas. Going back to the history of Chicago though, it wasn't always that safe. Chicago had a lot of gang problems in the 1920s talking about during the Prohibition, during the 1920s. Of course, the 20th Amendment, yes, 20th Amendment outlawed the sale and manufacturing of alcohol in the United States. It was the Volstead Act that actually gave it teeth. Anyway, so between about 1920-ish and 1933, alcohol sales were illegal, which didn't mean people stopped drinking. It just meant that it created a boom for organized crime. You've probably heard of Al Capone. He was the head of the gangs moving the illegal alcohol out of Canada, out of the Bahamas, out of other countries, into the area, into Chicago, and controlling that. Other great things about Chicago, let me see, past the 1920s. Of course, in the 1930s, Chicago was hit by depression really hard. World War I, the Navy Pier, I'm sure you guys will be there. It literally used to be the pier that the Navy ships docked at because it's deep. Now it's like a fun place. Ride the Ferris wheel if you get a chance, if it's not against the rules. If you have the money, it's a great view, and I get motion sick really easy. It didn't make me sick, so any of you can handle it. It gives you a beautiful view of the city. Anyway, that used to be the Navy Pier. Now it's sort of a tourist area where you get to hang out. So anyways, I hope you guys have a great time in the city. Oh, and just to make sure you're still watching, for homework, when you get back on Thursday, when you see me in the first class, you will have just a half a page summary of what I talked about in this video to prove that you watched it, because as we've learned, it's not good enough to do a quiz because everyone will find out the answers of the quiz, and I didn't really talk enough to talk about 5 different quiz materials. So make sure you have a half a page written out on this video what I talked about the history of Chicago. I'm sure you guys will have a great time. I hope you have a great weekend, long weekend over the 4th of July. Bye.